Yeah, I don't really need to see that much. I just need to know what slide I'm on. How about now? All right. A little technical difficulty getting the slides up there, but we're ready now. I'm sorry? No, I know. I know. All right, before we get started, I want to thank Joe Ferguson, I don't know if he's in the room, for the great job he did yesterday on legacy code. I sat in that one, sort of critique my own, really. I would say, unfortunately, some of my points will be the same, but I don't really think it's unfortunate. I think it really proves a point that the principles I'm going to talk about, that they work. Some of the stuff also will have heard in Corey's keynote yesterday. However, unlike Joe, I will be showing a little bit of code, even though some of it is embarrassing. Also, some of my content has already been described in detail, so I'll try not to be too repetitive. I'm going to encourage you to go back and watch some of the previous presentations if you want, if you're interested in these ideas. I'm here to describe how we migrated several large code bases that started on 5.3 runtime to PHP 8. While I will touch on some of the specific changes that were required to update the code, until it worked on 8, that's not really the focus of this talk. This isn't a talk about syntax tweaks or chasing deprecation notices. It's about fixing the habits that got us in trouble in the first place, and because if we don't change our habits, obviously no upgrade guide in the world will save us. More importantly, if we don't change the culture, we'll just be on the same boat again at some point in the future, and now it's going crazy. Oh, there's back. All right, who am I? I'm a PHP developer. I've been doing PHP for about 25 years. I started in PHP 4. I actually started programming on Visual Basic 5 and ASP 3, even before that. I've done almost all my PHP development on Windows and for Windows servers, which I know is not popular in this crowd or probably any crowd, honestly. But I like it that way. I've been done a fair amount of Linux development. Most of my time, in the beginning at least, was running PHP on IIS. I know that sounds kind of crazy today, but eventually I graduated to Apache. We were still on Windows at my last company. Keeps doing that. We'll see how it goes. Until 3 years ago, I was in the healthcare industry. I worked at the same job for almost 17 years. That's kind of annoying. Do you see it doing that? Okay. Make sure it's just not my imagination. I've been staring at this thing for so long, I could just be fading in and out. Eventually, let's make sure the connections are good. And of course, all my stuff's just going to fall over now. Let's see how that does that. All right. Until 3 years ago, I was in the healthcare industry, as I was saying. I was at the same job for almost 17 years. Where I wrote almost every single line of code or modified every single line of code of a very large code base. I left that job to take on a contractor role, where I had no insurance, a wife that's self-employed. I have two kids. They were 3 and 9 at the time. My first thought when I saw this challenge that I walked into, I'm going to talk about, was that I'd made a very terrible mistake. The fact that the PHP 5.3 was in use wasn't my biggest concern. My main concern was the fact that I was walking into a culture that actually thought being behind that far was actually acceptable. Would this existing team be supportive of moving forward? Changing culture is always harder than changing code. Because I've done most of my career in enterprise environments, I'm used to the fun stuff, fast feedback loops, corporate rules that make no sense, and security policies so bad they could practically be considered an attack surface. But don't worry, I'm not here to discuss platforms. I'm here to talk about principles. The principles that work in all environments that I'm going to discuss, no matter what your taste in code programming standards are or programming paradigms, even for those who prefer spaces over tabs. I'm also a very practical programmer. I believe in whatever works. And I'm not one who believes that there's only one way. I really enjoyed Corey's talk. He talked a lot about not being myopic, and I can tend to be that way at times. But instead it's more important that we come to an agreement that we're all going to do it the same way. I started at the company I'm at now, TIAA, in June of 2022. I was a contract developer, no title, no authority, no tenure, working with an analytics and reporting group of a very large call center. We have about 600 registered phone agents and leadership that support them. I began implementing best practices from the ground up. Also, I had no experience in the call center industry. It was all totally new for me. The existing lead developer, who I talked to before I had this talk, I said, just to let you know, I may be a little harsh about some of this stuff. And he goes, nah, it's fine. I knew what shape it was in. He said that guy, he had little interest in modern programming standards, but was very supportive of my ideas. If he was here, he would tell you how much he still loves PHP 4. God love him. Thankfully, I eventually, like I said, got off IIS. However, as recently as February of this year, Jan E., who I've done a lot of work with over the years because he does a lot of builds for PHP on Windows on Apache Lounge, he still thought I was doing IIS, which we've been off of that now at this company for a couple of years. But so he pointed me out as the guy he thought who might have some input on this merge request that could have an effect on PHP run on IIS. I did not. We'd been off it long enough that I didn't know what to tell him. But so imagine walking into a code base where every line of code exists in quantum superposition of being simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. That's a line I stole from our in-house LLM, but I thought it was cute and kind of described where we were at. When I began to survey the code, what I discovered can only be described as a master class in creative software development approaches that challenge every convention that we thought we knew. We're talking about over 1 million lines of code spread over multiple projects, a system that had been running in production for years, generating useful data analytics and serving users. Here's the kicker. I had no idea what most of the code actually did. For some of the code, nobody knew what it did or if it was even used. There were functions with cryptic names, variables called temp1 through temp47, and business logic buried in nested conditions that read like ancient riddles. It was like being handed a map in a language that had familiar letters but followed completely different grammar rules. Now, if all the code had been in the best possible shape for that particular version of PHP, we all know that this talk would be much shorter, right? However, that's rarely the case, especially when you walk into an environment where code has been out of support, the platform has been out of support for 3 or 4 years. That probably means that other aspects of code maintenance do not exist either, and that was the case here. There's a fascinating correlation between software systems when you find one area of significant debt is rarely an isolated incident. It's like finding one cockroach in your kitchen. There's probably many more. There's a fascinating correlation between software systems where you find one area of significant technical debt. It's rarely an isolated incident. When your runtime environment is years behind security patches and feature updates, it signals a broader pattern of deferred maintenance. Version control, deployment processes, coding standards, documentation, static and dynamic code analysis, code reviews, they all tend to suffer together in sort of a synchronized technical decay. This was just some examples of things I pulled up of the code repos that we were working on. We also, in the same process, we were tasked with refactoring 500,000 lines of Python code into PHP. This is just a sample. We maintain an intranet site. We call it the ECR. Originally, there were no classes. I mean, maybe 2. The root folder of that site was 800 files that were just. We had to sort of dig through them and figure out, okay, it'll stay on. Of course it goes off. That is a view, and these are controllers, right? We had to decipher that. Just as an example, one of the functions that took us over a year to rebuild the actual ETL. Does everybody know what an ETL is? I didn't until I got to the company I'm at now. I'd been building them for years and never knew that stood for extract, transform, and load. So we had an ETL that had a function called eval row. It was 400 lines with 20 plus global variables, no pass parameters, and then the if statements. Oh my God, it's crazy. I'll show you in a minute. Even the current lead dev couldn't read it. This is kind of how it started, right? It's just tons of global variables and 400 lines of this. So deployment at this point was less of a process and more of a spiritual journey. The architecture might follow what we would call a copy-paste design pattern. Working with 5.3 in the modern era was like being a digital archaeologist. We were dealing with a language that predated many of the safety features and conventions we take for granted today. When your language runtime is 3 to 4 years out of support, you're not just dealing with missing features, right? You're dealing with known security vulnerabilities and complete disconnect from the modern development ecosystem. For example, no use of packages. They were using some libraries they had pulled off the internet, sort of just dumping them in there in the midst of everything else. The application had embraced a bold architectural choice. Everything was global. Variables, state, configuration, it was all shared across the entire application, like a giant interconnected web of interdependencies. One second, I need to clear something. Our predecessors had achieved something remarkable. They had managed to maintain a large-scale application without ever embracing distributed version control. Every change was like a high-stakes performance with no safety net and no history, no ability to understand the code, the evolution of the code base. And besides, why do we? Oh, this is an example of global. Just as one of our projects, I just scanned it. It was at one point, and it showed up with 450 uses of the word global. That doesn't include all the global. Obviously, I wish you'd quit doing that. Most of the files were like this. So obviously those are all in the global namespace as well. They did have get, they were just sort of dumping like whole files into it and then calling it like commit number 70 or something like that. When I was trying to clean it up, I found a number of these. This was one of them, just a bunch of reports that were committed to the Git repo. There's 800 of those, and some of them are pretty large. And why do we need Git when we can just store our code we might need later or something in comments, right? Lots of that. I just threw this in here for fun because I found this interesting when I started working there, because we were on Windows and they had this ETL process where they wanted to, they would run a bunch of ETLs from another PHP process, but they didn't really want to manage them. So they wanted them to start the process, but then the main process would exit. And in Windows, you can't do that normally unless you do this. Which is the only way that I know of to actually separate the child process executable from the original PHP process. Otherwise, when the original master closes, the original closes, it closes all the child processes as well, unless you do that thing right there. And then when they would just fire them off and they would run for hours or days or whatever, I mean, no memory limits, no time limits, no nothing. Much of the code that we were working with was not created by the current development team. We had to sort of become code detectives, right? Digging through the various implementations, trying to reverse engineer business rules from code, which seemed to follow no discernible pattern, much of which we found out was wrong or not used anymore. Even with the original author present, the lack of documentation and coding standards meant that understanding the system's logic often required significant time digging through layers of duplicate unstructured code. In an enterprise environment, there's a perverse incentive structure where avoiding short-term pain creates massive long-term agony. Nobody wants to be the person who breaks something that's working, right? So we defer upgrades, skip maintenance, kick the can down the road until we're forced into a corner with a system that's 5 years out of support and hemorrhaging technical debt. And I'm not just talking about development. I mean, most of you probably know this, but I worked in IT in technical support and sysadmin before I became a developer, and it's the same across the board, maybe even worse in some of those other areas. Some of what I'm about to say is going to seem familiar after the talk given yesterday. Corey mentioned this. I believe we should flip the pain avoidance mindset. When you make upgrades, deployments, and refactoring routine, something magical happens. The pain diminishes because you become good at it. Your deployment process becomes reliable because you do it constantly. Your upgrade path becomes smooth because you're never more than a version or two behind. Your refactoring skills improve because you practice them regularly. The natural tendency of humans is to avoid things that are painful, right? Unless they come to realize some overriding benefit. About 20 years ago, I started taking a radically different approach. If it's painful, we should do it, and often, until it's not painful anymore, until we get good at it. In fact, anytime I see a pain point in our current process today, I have almost a visceral reaction where I just can't leave it alone. I want to get it addressed. And the irony is the things that we avoid because they are painful become exponentially more so over time because we wait longer and longer to do it, and more importantly, because we're not practicing those things. Focus on habits and process that incorporate these difficulties as part of your regular workflow. getting good at the hard parts the goal, and the rest will seem like icing on the cake. When I started this process, I found the same barriers to refactoring that I experienced early in my career. Some of these are self-created, others are cultural. Fear of breaking things or reprisal for mistakes made. Lack of automated testing means more overhead to ensure the change works. Lack of standards so that we are guessing at the best way to change the code. And of course, the big one is code cleanup time is not factored into our development tasks. We just don't have time for that, right? Just fix the bug. When something breaks, I tend to claim it whether it's my fault or not. I just sort of like something breaks, I'll go, oh, I probably did it, right? Then people sort of clamor for taking responsibility. They're not afraid of it because they see it's an important aspect of how we grow. My experience is if we take the tack that we'll fix it later, that later never comes. Code cleanup refactoring needs to be part of the process and treated as though it's important as the feature of the bug. When it comes to improving code, there's always a deadline. In fact, the moment the code is written, the clock is ticking. Eventually, there's always a deadline to a bug, new leadership, feature need, or just because everybody becomes so sick and tired of working with something that has such version constraints. When I started this project, we had no official deadline, but I knew that we were so far behind that waiting wasn't an option. We were running 5.3, which had been out of support for years. 7 was only going to be in support a few more months at the time, and 8.1 was the recommended version. Even 8.0 at that point only had a year left for support. I could feel the technical debt interest compounding daily, and I pushed for the fastest pace possible from the very beginning. 6 months into the project, our cybersecurity team issued an ITRC break and gave us 1 year, which would have been August of 23, to fix our outdated infrastructure. But here's the beautiful irony. Because I'd already been pushing for the fastest pace possible, I could tell the leadership we could easily meet that goal. Their original requirement was only to update to PHP 7.4. However, I knew that by the time we reached that version, it would already be months out of support. That mandate from cyber became my best ally. Suddenly, all the urgency I had been advocating for had external support. The nice-to-have improvements became compliance requirements, right? When we have time refactoring became mission-critical security updates. That mandate from cyber became my best allies. I'm sorry, I talked about that part. If I'd waited till the official deadline started pushing for modernization, we would have been scrambling, right? But because we were already moving at a maximum sustainable velocity, an aggressive deadline became achievable rather than impossible. In fact, the deadline dictated to us was about 3 months past my intended target date. The best way to handle a crisis, of course, is never let it become a crisis in the first place. To be clear, this was not at the expense of all the externally required work either. I had to orchestrate a massive Hadoop to Snowflake migration in the middle of this process. By then, I was the lead dev, thankfully, which that process including rewriting these crazy large SQL statements. And neither our updates nor the migration were delayed. In fact, I didn't even mention that when I came on board here, I was pretty strong on SQL, but this place showed me how much more I could learn. These guys were doing some amazing, magical stuff with SQL. They're pretty good at it. Just an interesting graphic of where we were at when we started this. Sometimes limitations force innovation, but they also highlight why industry standards exist. Version control, code standards, and structured deployment processes aren't bureaucracy. They are survival tools, for me at least. As most of you probably already know, technical problems rarely exist in isolation, as I've talked about. An outdated runtime environment is just the tip of the iceberg, indicating deeper systemic issues with a culture that cares only about the what and not about the how. I believe how we do development is equally as not, if not more important. A lesson I learned personally because I did it the hard way for 10 years. Initially, I was a sole programmer doing this all by myself, and I didn't really have any influence of anybody senior to me to actually help me understand why these things are important. So a lot of the stuff I'm talking about, I learned the hard way. Before judging legacy code, we should always consider the context in which it was written. Every line represents someone's attempt to solve a problem under specific constraints. And here's the humbling truth, is that especially considering this seemingly random, unstructured pile of spaghetti code, it was working pretty well, serving users, generating valid and useful reporting, and providing significant business value every day. Sometimes the most chaotic solutions are surprisingly resilient, which forced me to question my assumptions about what good code really means in practice. In fact, coming from an organization where I was the final decision maker regarding how our code was written for almost 2 decades, I had become pretty rigid in my ideas, and this exercise actually helped me loosen up a bit. My first rule for transforming a legacy code base is that you can't mandate change. I believe in leading by example. You must demonstrate it. As a contractor, initially, with no management authority, I had to show the value of modern practices through demonstrating my own habits visibly and producing results like how easy it is to make this change now, right? Showing them, not through PowerPoint presentations or policy documents. Even standards I don't like are still better than no standards. So I think somebody mentioned something like that yesterday. To form a standard was our foundation principle. That's what we really focused on. Standards force developers to think about the code more thoroughly and actually make a decision or discuss the code rather than just throwing something together. We started with basic formatting and naming conventions, simple stuff that immediately made the code base more readable. Ever tried testing raw PHP files with no classes and few functions? That's a lot of fun. When your entire application is a collection of procedural scripts with global variables, traditional unit testing becomes, let's just say, creative. We had to start by refactoring just enough structure to make testing possible, then gradually expanding our coverage. Early unit test, right? That's an ETL. There's a bunch of those, several hundred of them. We just imported, or required the file into a function, into a unit test function. You had to have that ETL ID. That was the way they were all passed in. And then none of these were supposed to ever output any output whatsoever. So if there's an error or any output, we would know something changed. And so initially, just to get testing on all of them, we just did a bunch of those. Static analysis. We created initial PHP Storm inspection profiles, just the most critical ones to start. And if you're not a fan of PHP Storm, leave. No, just kidding. But seriously, pick your poison. PHP Stan, which we use now as well, or Psalm. Joe described PHP Stan in detail yesterday and did a great job of that. The key was creating baselines, identifying those issues that were most critical, and tackling them systematically rather than being overwhelmed by the tsunami of warnings. Even in seemingly random code, patterns exist. We spent time identifying the repeated logic, the common approaches, and the underlying business rules that were buried in this implementation. This pattern recognition became the foundation for our refactoring strategy. I talked about all that copy pasta. Sometimes I had to rewrite a file several times, condensing and abstracting over and over again to suddenly realize, and I'm not kidding, there was one, it was 400 or 500 lines of these two similar looking files. I boiled it down to that those two files were exactly the same except for one line. But I couldn't see it initially because the inconsistency of styles, and both of them had been rewritten many times over the years. Every time someone had to hunt through 5 different files to fix the same bug, that became a teaching moment. Pain is a powerful motivator for change. We documented these frustrations and used them to build a consensus around the need for improvement. I had to be pretty delicate in the beginning, because I was still building trust with this team. Today, I regularly throw up a piece of code into our team's group with a title like "How to make your boss go crazy for 3 hours" or something like that. And then I try to provide a constructive framework for the discussion. And a lot of times it's mine, right? Because I'm quick to see at times that I can do things better than I did the last time, or I wrote code 3 years ago when I started that I can see was not a very good idea. And then we talk about why it's so difficult and ways we can help each other be better. I usually end it with something like, "And your teammates or your future self will thank you," which that last part is something I learned again over the years. This was the first inspection run on that intranet site that I showed you. This was just the bare minimum inspections running on it. It's 35,000 errors, 180,000 warnings, This is just an attempt to get started, really. Initially, we dumped everything we had into giant classes and minimal functions as an intermediate step. This sounds like terrible from a purist perspective, of course, but we had to have some logic to get the thing going. Sometimes progress means going from chaos to organized chaos before you can reach some kind of elegance. Removing all the global variables in code was perhaps the biggest architectural challenge. The global state was everywhere, and untangling it required careful dependency mapping and gradual refactoring. We couldn't eliminate globals overnight, but we could stop creating new ones, right, and slowly encapsulate the existing ones. Variables named temp1 through temp47 don't tell you much about business intent. We do practice clean code that we should not need comments. We should be readable like a book. I know, again, some of you probably aren't a big fan of that style. I'll be happy to let you tell me about it later. We spend a lot of time on naming and renaming and renaming. In fact, I believe the name should really be the driver. What's in a name? I think for programmers, it can mean just about everything. We spend an enormous amount of time just making the code readable, renaming variables, extracting functions, creating names that explain the why behind the code. Remember those 5 to 10 copies of a nearly identical code? Each consolidation was a small victory. We developed a systematic approach to identifying, consolidating, replacing duplicate functionality, creating a single source of truth for business logic. Now I'm going to put on my PHP Storm fanboy hat for a second, because I want to emphasize what an important role PHP Storm plays for us. The main reasons are for its inspections and refactoring. While not perfect, the refactoring tools allow us to make huge changes across the entire code base quickly. Quickly is the key here because we were working these standards out on the fly, which means we might rename hundreds of functions or variables and then change our mind a week later, and we could easily do that. Building an inspection profile that was our initial target and slowly adding additional inspections as we go is something we did and still do rely on. While PHP Stand is great, having the immediate feedback that the code does match our rules as we're working is invaluable. And I know you can run PHP Stand. If you use PHP Storm and inspections, you can run PHP Stand as part of that. It's really slow for us, so we generally only run that as part of our CI/CD build. After we got the first wave of inspections to pass, the rule became, don't push your code if any inspections are being flagged, no matter how trivial. We store all our critical PHP Storm settings in the project, so everybody gets the same settings, inspections, code style, data sources, you name it. Another great thing about PHP Storm is its language level settings. So as we increment the runtime, we can increment these settings, which we also store in the Git repo, which quickly tells us most, if not all, the changes we're going to need to make to be compliant. For example, recently, as 8.4 deprecated the e-user error constant. We turn on we flagged that one, and we immediately started making those changes. For us, deprecation means it's going away, so start working on it now. And we've already removed all of those. We've converted all of those to exceptions. All right, jump past that. We created all kinds of strange tests initially, just to help the code be more portable and give us some confidence. As we started working on a local development environment, I didn't even mention that. We didn't. Initially, they were doing development environment on a separate server that didn't really match the production server. It was extremely slow, and we were all trying to use it. So we had to create tests like, we created a test that basically just ran the linter across it initially, just to see if we broke anything, the built-in linter for PHP. We had to create a paths test, because they had all these absolute paths in the production code, and if you wanted to work on it, you had to go change them. So we started by writing these functions that would actually rewrite those paths on the fly, so depending on what environment you're in, it would still work, just to get it to work at all. Eventually, we removed all of those. But to make sure that they worked, we actually put a test in there so you could run the test to see if the code would work on your environment, which included parsing all the various paths and see if they actually exist where you were at. One of the, just as an example, of how hard it can be sometimes to rewrite code bases this large that are this old is when we crossed over the 8.1 threshold, we went from 7.4 to 8.2, but when we crossed over the 8.1 threshold, 8.1 deprecated tons of use of null and various functions, and we had hundreds of those we had to chase down. Sometimes they were easy. Sometimes we just cast them or use null coalescing. Other times we had no idea. The developer actually had an intent for that, so we would figure, it works like this, and we just have to change it, see if it breaks it or not. Sometimes we would just, have to work through them all. there are lots of other things I could talk about we had to address. Like I said, originally when I changed companies, we were on Apache, but went to a company where, strangely enough, they were also using PHP on IS. I thought, and they didn't even know when they hired me that I did that. It was like they hired probably one of the very few guys that actually had tremendous experience with that, luckily. But I also had experience getting them off that. So we moved from IS to Apache in the same process, all within the same time frame. We created a local development environment. It's a very hodgepodge of our own stuff. We're trying to move to Docker right now, but that's slow. JavaScript, for example, was running jQuery 2.1.1, which was released in 2014. There were others. Those are just some examples of what we were facing. So, and I think Ian asked me in the preview I did for this, so I threw it in here as well, is why didn't we go from 5 to 8 directly? It's a lot of changes to make, right? The code is really brittle in some places. And basically what we did instead is focus on improving the code in general, making core improvements to the code, making sure those worked into production, and then we would make the language changes, only the language changes that were necessary to move the runtime forward. Once the code improvements worked, we would increment the runtime. We went from 5.3 to 5.6, and then actually went from 5.6, we were on 32-bit PHP at the time, so we went to 64-bit, and then we moved to 7.4 and finally to 8.2. It took us 13 months from the time I started to finally get to 8.2. In the last few months, we have finally converted all the global code. We have all the global code to class structures. The internal site is now roughly MVC, very rough, but it's getting there. And as we start to iterate to something more modern. And the success we had came through careful incremental improvements while maintaining system stability, right? We're rebuilding an airplane while it's flying, right? We're trying to keep everything working. We had massive changes we needed to make along the way while we were doing this. While the motivation was to bring the code into the modern era, the real goal here was to change the culture, right? So that refactoring, updating, testing, and improvements became the how we did our work, not something we tried to shoehorn in after everything else was done. It's much easier to stay current than it is to get current. That's something I learned in my personal life. And I apply it to how I work as well. We are currently on 8.4.12, and we stay within about 6 weeks of the current point release. Point release updates take about 2 hours and require no oversight, almost no oversight. We just rely completely on automated testing for these. Minor releases can be done. They do take more effort, but still we rely mostly on the automated testing except for critical changes. This was the ETL that had that eval row I was talking about. One of the hardest ones to figure out the business logic in. It took us a year. We made several attempts to rewrite it. Originally, it was 1,243 lines. It did have functions, right? At least it had something, right? Well, some of them didn't even have that. This is what it looked like. Now, we've iterated to something even more modern. Since we've basically rewritten the entire process now because we've actually moved to a new version of the data source platform that we're pulling from. But when the final version of it before we did that was this, which at least, is getting there, and is only 479 lines. It's all the same code boiled down into functions, right? A lot of it was just those if statements I showed you was just the same thing over and over again repeated. That same project that I was showing you had 450 uses. The word global has 10, and those are there on purpose. We're working on a more sophisticated way of handling those, but there's, that's all we have left of those to deal with. We rewrote that ETL process. I told you that sort of fire and forget thing. We're now using Symphony process that actually manages those things from beginning to end, monitoring for runtime, all of that. The internet code site was at 549,000 lines. It's actually at 862,000 lines now, but of course, only 180,000 of that is ours, right? Because now we use packages and we pull in libraries. We don't have to manage all that code anymore. That 800 files in the root folder of that project that I was showing you is now technically one PHP folder, right? That's just the view. We use Apache for routing. All the code is, of course, now stored in, we use the company I work for has an in-house private instance of GitLab where we store all our code. I work for a financial company. Everything we have is pretty secure. Code reviews are a standard part of the QA process. We moved to Team City. We implemented that for CI/CD and it manages our deployment. All of that is run by Team City. Just show you that we keep our unit tests passing. We have code coverage. This is the intranet side at 90% currently. Today I'm the director of that team. I said all of them are online. There's a couple that aren't attending this conference, but I think most of them are online. I think most of them are in this, actually probably watching this. I told them they didn't have to. They hear me enough, right? But several of them said they were going to. So maybe they're listening to this today. As far as I can tell, and they can tell me when I get home if I'm wrong, but they seem pretty bought in on all of this, right? I showed them the value of making these changes, helped them understand that, I'm not just telling you this because I think it's a good idea. I'm telling you this because it'll make you want to do your work more. It'll make you enjoy your job more, right? And I always try to be really supportive of people wherever they are at in their careers. All right. Like I said, we refactored the entire internet site into a loose MVC. I think I already talked about that. And of course, I just threw this up there because I think these are important to always talk about. As Corey, I think, said, we don't necessarily follow every principle that you ever heard out there. I think most of them probably have value and to some degree. I strongly believe in the first one there, that people, regularly want to throw in code there for something that they might need down the road, right? Don't do it. Just don't do it. I mean, if you really want to save that, you got an idea, stick it in a branch and shove it over somewhere, but not into the code that you're actually sending to production. I can't tell you, we probably removed 60% of the code of all the code bases, just removed it because it wasn't being used or it was duplicated or whatever. Obviously, don't repeat yourself. I might argue with Corey on that a little bit just because it's practically a religion for me because I can't stand that. I need to be reminded regularly that although I'm pretty creative when I'm writing code because I've been doing it a long time, that being creative is not always helpful, right? Most time you just want very straightforward, easy to read code. I threw open close on there. That's something we still have to talk about regularly of stop creating public methods. You don't need them. And then my personal favorite, and this is where I'll end this talk is, in my personal life, I discovered about 23 years ago, I made a pretty significant change in how I was living my life. I had spent 31 years of my life basically being a taker. I mean, in everything I did, I was always, I was rarely looking out for anybody but myself. And in the process of trying to change that, I discovered an important principle is always leave it cleaner than you found it. And I didn't even know that was the Boy Scout rule until someone told me that later. That's what they call it. I don't actually know if it is. But that's something that it really resonates with me today is that in everything I do, with my family, here with you this weekend, is I always try to leave more than I take. And I try to instill that in my team, is that when you're working on code, it's not just about fixing the thing in front of you. It is looking for ways to always be improving. Because if you're waiting for a time when you're going to get to go back and improve your code, that's probably never going to happen, right? It's build that into your process. They hand me code that I'm doing a code review on, and or I'm doing the merge for, and I see, oh, well, there's something there that could have been addressed. Why didn't you address it? I mean, we have that conversation, right? I don't just hammer them about it, but we talk about it. Why didn't you address it? Sometimes it's because I didn't know how. Well, you could have made a note to one of us or created a JIRA issue, and one of us could address it at some point, just so we know it had been paid attention to. But we encourage freely making changes to the code. Commit it separately, right? Not as part of the change that on the thing you're working on. Keep that separate so someone can review it separately and we can backtrack if there's ever a problem. But be free to, if there's a barrier that keeps you from making that change, because like I said, you're afraid of making a mistake, you're not sure exactly, maybe even sometimes, I don't know what the commit message should look like. Okay, well, we can fix that, right? Just get it done, make the effort, right? To me, that's so important because what it does is it starts to give everybody sort of an ownership of let's always keep the code moving forward, whether it's my responsibility or not. If I see it, then it's now my responsibility. So that's all I got. Sure.
Can you please go back one slide? All right. The last one, in brackets, only took 3 years. Only took 3 years. I don't think 3 years is only that.
No, it's a joke, I know.
But then, what was the scope of the project? And then how many people were working on it as a team?
Well, I mean, scope, how are you going to define scope? I mean, Oh, sorry. The question was what was the scope of the project? How many people were working on it? Was that it? Okay. Well, as I said, all total is 1.1 million lines, well, 1.6 million lines of code if you include the 500,000 lines of Python code that we had to rewrite or update. Two main projects, an internal intranet site and the ETLs several hundred of those that process a tremendous amount of data. Initially, when I started working there, we had 4 people on the team. The lead dev eventually left and went to a different department, and I took over as the lead dev. Currently, we have 5 people on that team. So through most of the project, we had 4 people on the team. Well, we had reporting analysts that help us out as well. They're also on our team, but they're not PHP developers. So technically, 4 people doing that work. Like I said, we did the bulk of the work to get it to PHP 8.2 and to get most of these pieces in place that I've talked about in about 13 months. But that didn't include, we've just, after we got those, then we continued the rewrite to get all the code out of global scope, all the intranet site into a roughly MVC architecture, right? That's what we just completed. We finally got all of that done.
And lastly, in all this, how many kind of tables, number of tables were you playing with?
You're talking about in a data?
The database tables. Yeah,
Oh.
number of tables.
Well, we actually use Oracle as our primary database, which I can't stand. We're slowly migrating to Snowflake. Our Oracle database that belongs to the application was 300 tables, something like that. The database size is roughly 50 gigabytes. It's a data analysis team. We do reporting analytics for a call center, and so we generate. Loved Scott's talk. Scott, right? Yeah. Yesterday we talked about denormalization because we do that. We do a tremendous amount of taking data and combining it and producing tables that are easy to do reporting on.
So you rendered some tables redundant, you took some away, you had to add some.
Mm-hmm.
You said you had about 50 gig of data.
Mm-hmm.
That was quite a work.
It is. Yeah, that's like I said. That's what this team does. Is and so we build as a PHP developer. We're really building the supporting processes for for the reporting, not just for our team. Other teams use our data as well for reporting, but that's primarily what we do. The intranet site that we build maintains some of that, provides a reporting platform for that. We build applications on there as well for data that is not pulled from one that we like our Genesis phone system or the various other places that we pull data from. But our primary role is to produce data sets that people can do reporting on. So it's kind of, for us, it's status quo. That's what we do every day. But I know it's not what everybody does. Yes.
My question is about the organization outside of IT, because what I have experienced in the past is sometimes when things are not working well, the stakeholders outside of IT will have their friend or that nice person in support or whatever that kind of has a little skunkworks path to either fixing a problem or adding a feature, and then that tends to leave when that person either moves on or they just don't remember. There's no documentation. Did you find that culturally that you had to deal with that?
Oh, yes. We still do to some degree. We've worked on trying to remove it. In fact, when I started, everybody was sort of working on their own. I mean, I wouldn't even barely call it a team, right? And people had their own person they could talk to get changes made. They still do, although I've been pretty adamant. It all has to come through our specific process. We have total visibility on that. We're not, I won't say we're always completely in sync, but for the most part, people understand that if they come to you directly, it still needs to come back through the team. We need to have some evaluation on this process. Maybe we agree, maybe we just go ahead and do it, it's fine, but at least that we have some visibility on it, document it properly, make sure all that, whatever the requirements are captured properly, all of that stuff, because only recently, only in the last few months, I would say that we finally knocked out most of the big ones that were still outliers, that if one particular person who's got a tremendous amount of experience, if he left, we still have maybe one that we were probably a little sketchy on, but we're trying to shore up all of that. Anything else? Thank you for your time.